All right, so today I'm cutting to the chase. I'm going to be revealing the exact strategy that I've taught thousands of online students to become great jazz improvisers, and exactly the way I suggest everyone work on jazz no matter what instrument you play. Let's do this thing. What's up, Brent here from LearnJazzStandards.com, which is a blog, a podcast, and videos all geared towards helping you become a better jazz musician. In case you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe at the button below, hit the bell notification button so that you never miss out on anything going on here. Now, when it comes to becoming a great jazz musician, it doesn't really matter what instrument you play. For me, strategy is really important, especially as a teacher, as I'm trying to lead my students towards quicker success as a jazz improviser to reach their musical goals. So I've done a lot of videos in the past and on my podcast, lots of training where things are kind of just like spread out everywhere on different aspects of what I actually do and what I actually teach. But in this video, I really just want to get behind my computer and kind of just walk you through my exact strategy for jazz improvisation and what I would really recommend every instrument do in order to improve quicker. All right, so we're behind my computer here and we have the most fancy technology ever, Paint 3D up to try to show you here what my strategy is from the top, bottom. Okay, so I'm gonna start with this big circle here, and this big circle, I'm gonna title this Jazz Improv, okay? Because this is the strategy that we're gonna use for all instruments. It doesn't matter what instrument you play. This is the strategy. All right, let's do another circle right here. And I wanna do another circle right here, just for starters. And just to like show you here, let's draw some lines, fancy little lines connecting the two. All right, so to start, this is kind of like an overhead overview, and then we're gonna dive deep into one of them particularly. But this one, let's start here. We're gonna call it instrument specific. And this one over here is the three pillars. I'm gonna explain what the three pillars are in just 1 second. Okay, but when we talk about instrument specific, so when we talk about jazz improv, there's kind of two categories that I think we're dealing with here. We're dealing with just being able to play your instrument appropriately, all right? So let's start listing off just a few things that would be appropriate. So scales, right? So scales are gonna be helpful for you if you need to navigate your instrument better. Let's say you're a guitar player, so you need to know some chord voicings, or you're a bass player. You need to learn how to walk some basic bass lines, right? There we go. Walk some bass lines. Maybe you're a saxophone player and you need to work on fingerings, right? I'm not a saxophone player, so I don't know all the different things you should do. Maybe it's trumpet and you need to work on long tones, whatever it is to learn how to play your instrument. And some of these things can be a little bit more jazz specific, like I said, bass lines for bass players. But for the most part, it's just, can I play my instrument? Because jazz does sort of require that you do know how to play your instrument to some degree. Now, the big question though is, all these little fundamental things like knowing your scales, knowing your chords, and how to actually play it on your instrument. How much time should you be spending doing that, right? How much time you should be spending doing that. So here's where it really depends on how far along you are. If you're a complete beginner and you don't really even know how to play your instrument, then this should be 90%, right? You need to be doing that. But that's not what most of you watching this video, that's not the position most of you are in. Most of you actually do know how to play your instrument fairly well already, or at least have some proficiency. Maybe there's some holes in there. So you don't need to spend that much time. Actually, what I would say is fair is 10%, 10%, maybe 15%. If you need a little extra work, 20%, right? But for me, the other 90% is over here at the three pillars, okay? So 90% of your time should be spent on the three pillars if you want to become a great jazz improviser, okay? Because when it comes to just playing your instrument, that's part of it. That's the ability. It's like having the ingredients there, but you need to throw it all together to make actual jazz improv, right? So 10% on your instrument, so 90% on the three pillars. So that should tell you that you really need to like shift some of that focus away from, if you're a guitar player, for example, oh, I want to learn how to play every single drop two voicing. There's nothing wrong with that. Use your 10% right here if that's what you want to work on, right? But you don't need to be spending your 100% or your 80% or your 50% working on that, right? Unless it's really holding you back from doing something that you want to execute that's going to help you with jazz improv, right? Or if you're like obsessed with scales, right? No matter what, like most instrumentalists get a little bit obsessed with scales. So you're trying to learn every single scale there possibly is, right? And you're spending 80% of your time doing that. Well, guess what? That's not going to really help you as much with your jazz improv as the 3 pillars are, okay? So what I'd like you to think about is, if you're spending most of your time on instrument specific stuff that is like specific to your instrument, and you already have some of those things down, you already have some skills you can play, well, it's fine to work on these things and use your 10 to 15, maybe 20% on that. But if you really want to accelerate your jazz skills, it's these 3 pillars, okay? So with all that being said here, what I'd love to do is zoom in. I'm going to delete this. I want to zoom in on the 3 pillars, okay? So let's start like some more circles here. All right, so right here, and let's write in 3 pillars, the 3 pillars. All right, these are super, super, super important to me. Now, as mentioned, there are 3 of them, so let's go ahead and put in those 3. I guess I could just duplicate that circle. Use this technology a little bit more efficiently. Okay. Beautiful. Now, somewhere at some point, 3 pillars disappeared, so we'll add that back. All right, now let's go over the first of the 3 pillars, okay? The first of the 3 pillars. And that is jazz technique. Okay, jazz technique. Now, these 3 pillars are what I would consider to be 3 important pieces of your practice in every session, if not most sessions, that if you have some of this together and they're all working together cohesively, we'll go into that in a second, then you are going to improve much more rapidly. So jazz technique. Now, this isn't necessarily the instrument-specific technique I was talking about, okay? Jazz technique is spelling chord changes, all right? Jazz technique is guide tones. Jazz technique is stuff like enclosure patterns. Like this is something that's done commonly in bebop, where you're theoretically thinking about it as your approach tones, chromatically above and descending. So more theoretical stuff. Jazz technique is voice leading. Okay, so you could do this with chord changes, like going up one set of chord changes into the next chord, you go down connecting to the nearest chord tone. So these to me are jazz technique things. And another one I would add in here that I use in one of my courses is patterns. Now patterns, and you can apply these to scales or other things, but patterns are important because you do want to build your ability to have flexibility on your instrument to be able to play different intervals, because when we're improvising melodies. But if you're held back by the ability to play those intervallic leaps and changes, then that's going to stop you, right, from doing what you want to do melodically and musically. So all these things, right? Like if you can't really spell out the chord changes over a jazz standard, there's going to be a problem. If you don't really know what the guide tones are, which are the thirds and sevenths, the most important notes in each chord to target, then you're going to be a little bit lost when it comes to really spelling out those chord changes and knowing the ones you should really be resolving to a lot. Enclosures is just another way to, help you understand chromaticism and some of those jazz isms, if you will. Voice leading is super important, whether you're a chordal player or just a horn player, like a melodic player. Okay, so this is jazz technique. All right, so that's pillar number 1. Pillar number 2 is jazz repertoire. Now, this is the most important one, and I'm going to show you in a second how these kind of work together. But jazz repertoire, what's that like? And it's pretty simple, actually. It's learning jazz standards, right? Now, the jazz standards are going to teach us how to play. If you're not learning jazz standards, you're not really going to be able to play in jam sessions. You're not going to really understand how to improvise You're not going to understand how to improvise over jazz because these are the common tunes that we're playing, right, together. So the more jazz standards you learn and experiment with and improvise over, the more you're going to understand jazz harmony, the easier it gets to learn new tunes to improvise over other tunes. So jazz repertoire, really important. Okay. And then finally, last but certainly not least, is pillar number 3, which is jazz language. Okay, now jazz language, what do I mean by that? So when we have jazz standards and we know those things, we have to start figuring out, like, how do jazz musicians speak? So I call that micro language, or we call these licks as well, like learning short phrases over chord progressions. And then I call it macro language, which is like learning a chorus of a solo or 2 choruses of a solo or even an entire chorus of a solo. And I also would include in here, which I like to use a lot in my courses and materials, is etudes. Now, etudes are basically the same thing in a jazz context as solos, but usually there are some themes based around it that will help you specifically improvise over a particular tune or work on a particular concept, okay? So these are the 3 pillars. And that might seem like a lot of stuff right there that you actually have to work on. But let's kind of break this down a little bit more so that it's a little bit more digestible for us. So I'm going to erase these 3 pillars. And let's just start with the mother of all the pillars, which is jazz repertoire, okay? And so I'm going to title this Learn Jazz Standard, okay? So the goal is we're going to learn a jazz standard. But what we're going to do is we're going to combine all of the different pillars together to basically help us learn this jazz standard really, really well. All right, so the next step would be, and actually let's draw some lines here. Where is that? Some lines to make this clear. So, all right. So what we're going to do now, so we're learning a jazz standard. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to learn the melody by ear. Okay, super important. Now, this is technically micro jazz language, okay? Because you're learning the melody by ear. Now, you would do this over a period of time, and I have other videos and tutorials, and certainly inside my Inner Circle membership and courses, we have everything broken up into practice programs. I did a recent video, how to dominate a jazz standard in 1 month. I'll leave that up in the cards if you want to check that out later. But you're going to learn the melody by ear. And yes, there's effective ways to do that and strategies that I also teach, but we're not going to go over that in this episode. Okay, so the next step is we're going to learn the chord changes by ear. Now, I would still consider this to be micro jazz language, right? Now, if you can't learn the chord changes by ear and you need some help with sheet music, that's totally fine too. I also do have strategies I'm not going to talk about in this video of how to actually do that. But essentially, we are learning the language. We're learning the harmonic language. We learn the melodic language first, and then we're learning the harmonic language. So once you have that information down, you've got the firm starting place, and then we can start thinking about improvisation, right? So the next step here is what I call the mapping sequence. Okay, mapping. And this is under the pillar number 1, which is technique. Okay, so mapping is essentially taking the chord tones, okay, and voice leading them together, and then taking the guide tones and voice leading them together, and then finally taking basic scales and voice leading them together as an exercise over all the chord changes. And essentially what the mapping is doing is it is on your instrument being completely aware of what all the notes are that you can choose from to start creating improvisation, right? It's not like music, but it's the technical aspect of it, like knowing what it is, being able to play all those notes on your instrument. Okay, so those are 3 different maps: the chord tone maps, the guide tone maps, and the scale maps. So this is kind of like giving you the basis, the baseline for improvisation. I know what the notes are. Okay, so that's a super important part. Now, next, after that, this is a really important one. We're gonna start learning some language. This is pillar number 3. And so in this case, it could be a whole solo, it could be a chorus of a solo, something like that, but I'm just gonna choose an etude. So we're gonna learn an etude over top of that jazz standard. And for this, I'll call this macro language, right? Because it's a lot of melodic information that we're learning here. So we'll call that macro language. Okay. Now, again, I called the melody micro and stuff like that. I guess maybe it's technically macro too, because I usually think of micro more as licks. Either way, you're learning jazz language. So notice so far we have a jazz standard that we're learning, right? So if we actually look at these two right here, this is all pillar number 2, which is repertoire, okay? So those are pillar number 2, repertoire, and you're learning language at the same time. Then we moved on to the technique. And then we have the etude, which is macro language. Now this isn't the final step though. So the next step that we go to here is also language, but it's what I call the creation phase. So creation. And so we'll put language beside this. So creation can be 2 different things. One, it can be composition. Whoops. And then 2, it can be improvisation. All right, so either composition or improvisation. And what's the difference? So composition is slowing improvisation down. So you learned an etude already over the jazz standard, and now what you can do is compose your own etude with all that mapping information, with the melody that you learned, with the etude you learned. You have stuff to work with to start creating your own ideas, right? This is really important. And the difference with improvisation is you're actually just going to be composing quickly, right? Now, I always suggest doing some composition because composition will help you slow down the improvisation process, but also you do want to just improvise, right? Without just like trying and experimenting and messing up, you won't become a better jazz improviser. So if you do all of these things, you're going to have a really solid foundation for jazz improvisation. Now, actually working through this stuff and having material can be really helpful. So what I would suggest you do is check out my Learn Jazz Standards Inner Circle membership. So we learn a jazz standard every single month in our Jazz Standards Club, where I provide all of the stuff for you for this. I provide an etude from a professional jazz musician. I provide the mapping exercises. I provide a community of other musicians who are doing it with you to leave feedback and to record your stuff and show everybody. And you know, we all help and we learn and we grow together, as well as you get access to all my courses and all that other stuff too. But as far as learning a jazz standard really well and start improvising over it quickly, this is my formula and this is the stuff I suggest to everybody. And this is what we should be spending 90%, no matter what instrument you play, spend 90% working on these 3 pillars and in a fashion like I just showed you with learning this jazz standard. So what I'd love to hear from you in the comments is, you know, what is your strategy for jazz improvisation? Leave that down below. Would love to hear as many thoughts about how you go about improvising over jazz standards. Okay, now make sure you do check out my Inner Circle membership if that sounds interesting to you. I'll leave that in the card over there. And make sure you subscribe and like this video if it was helpful for you. And I'll see you in the next video.